episode 12 of season 12. We're almost done with season 12 of Mentioned in Dispatches. And while some folks may be sad to see Mentioned in Dispatches take the summer break, the flip side of it is plenty of other people are going to be all excited because that means it's convention season. And that means it's time for us to start showing up at different conventions and having all kinds of real world events. So it's a trade-off, right? We'll trade in the recordings of the podcast for some live streams from conventions and other events here and there. Tonight, our buddy Rocky is back. Rocky, how you doing tonight?
Hey, hello.
Yeah. We keep saying tonight. It's tonight as we record this. I know Fred listens in the morning when he's walking the dog. I'm not sure when any other people are listening to this, but Byron is back also. And Byron, I got to ask, isn't there a hockey game on somewhere that you're like contractually required to watch as a Canadian?
There probably is, but I don't follow hockey as maybe closely as I'm required to by law. Please don't tell the RCMP that, because the last thing I want is be end up the night incarcerated.
Yeah. Yeah, the hockey playoffs have started as we are recording this, and so source of much joy down here in Raleigh, where we've actually got a team worth being happy about for the moment.
Yeah.
It's been enjoyable so far. Tonight's episode is all Byron's fault. Usually when Byron's here, whatever it is, it's his fault. In this case,
and even when I'm not here, it's usually my fault.
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to give you too much credit, but if you want to take it and run with it, I'm okay with that. But we brought Rocky back also because this is an area of interest for him as well, and that is looking at RPGs, but specifically looking at historical RPGs. So if we start looking at war games with historical underpinnings and historical content, there's a significant Venn diagram overlap with the RPG content. And the intent here tonight is not necessarily to like get into parsing the differences between war games and role-playing games. That's not what we're trying to do, right? We're not going on the 14th jihad of definitional, doctrinal perfection. But looking more specifically at some of those RPG issues and what are they? Why would we want to play them? What are some particular areas of interest and facets of interest with those RPGs and why wargamers and historically minded gamers would be interested in those? And and not only that, but Byron actually put together show notes, which is a little disturbing. So, he's way too prepared for this. So kicking all of this off, Byron, what is a historical RPG? What are these things?
Well, in my opinion, a historical RPG is any role-playing game that reflects events that occurred or could have occurred or history adjacent in the history of our planet. So it isn't science fiction, it isn't fantasy, it isn't Cthulhu. It is specifically things that you can take a look at in the past and say, the Roman Empire, the rise of Napoleon, or whatever it is, and role-playing games that are set within those milieu.
You made a note in the show notes there about sort of history adjacent or alt history. One of the ones that you noted was Twilight 2000. And where I find that interesting is like, as we're sitting here today in the year 2024, Twilight 2000 is a quarter century behind us. Not from when it was published, but from when it supposedly takes place. Now, clearly the timeline from 95 to 2000 that was packaged in that game did not happen. Because, it's not some apocalyptic setting these days. But as you look back through, I'll steal a phrase from Robert Heinlein, right? The past through tomorrow. As you're looking back at this alternate history, would you package those into that historical RPG, setting, or is that going to be something that's similar but not really what you're after here?
Well, I'm going to let Rocky take that one.
I'm fine calling it a historical RPG, mostly because although the world situation and the setting may not be strictly historical, how you're operating, the tools that you have available, the culture of the time, so to speak, that you may be trying to place your characters in is the historical, or at least the historically plausible alternate version of what happened there. I mean, I had the original Twilight 2000 in 1986, and we didn't use it so much as a future game, but as more as like a modern game. And then quickly, as 2000 came and went, it became a historical game, but still very much it was you were drawing upon the day. I lived in Colorado, so we were all doing our Red Dawn scenarios of Twilight 2000 all the time. Historical, yeah. I mean, has the Cold War ended? You sort of look back and you laughed a little bit, but you just all that really did is it gave you more tools instead of having to go to Jane's. A lot of it was out more in the open. So it was all still historical, and it was all. I mean, even though that wasn't the history that happened, it was like Byron says, it was the history that could have happened. It was plausible, and it still counts as a historical RPG, in my opinion. Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned.
I agree. I think some of those things that we see, like Indiana Jones, where we find the Ark of the Covenant, that isn't, even though that happens in a historical time frame, or even maybe The Rocketeer. I would not call those, even though those happen in a historical time frame. There's a fantastic element, something that melts Nazis, that shows up in those. So I would sort of call that historical adjacent, but because of that introduction of fantasy or timeline altering physics or science or whatever, I do sort of take a look at true history or the history, as you said, that could have happened.
Yeah. Rocky, you mentioned the Red Dawn scenarios up there in Colorado. One of the reasons I think there was a certain population of military affiliated people that always glommed onto T2K is that it was one of the very rare role-playing games out there in which you could stat yourself out as a realistic character in the game and have it be entirely plausible, right? Because when it came out, I was living in Germany in the mid 80s with my father being in the military. But look, if they officially had plans for non-combatant evacuation operations, they were going to go out the window. Like if the shit hit the fan, we were stuck in Europe, and as 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, we were going to have to figure out how to survive. And you could legitimately stat yourself out and have a plausible plot line within the T2K world. And there was literal, I can't think of any other role-playing game on the planet at the time that let you do that, which I think made for some interesting, not adventures, but perspectives on T2K specifically. So.
Let's step back for a moment, though, to what Byron said about how some of the Rocketeer and some of those other call them pulpy versions of history or pulpy stories are not historical. I would maybe not be so. I gotta say for myself, I'm not so hard over on that. So a lot of my first historical RPG, and I will get to it, but my first historical RPG was Behind Enemy Lines by FASA in the early 80s. And so yes, you're supposed to be a squad of soldiers working behind enemy lines in Europe, going and fighting the Nazis and stuff. But a lot of the way we played that was like in the old TV serials of combat, those older, very much action, in some ways very pulpy adventures, adventure series. So it was historical, yes. Serious, yes. Yeah. But the stories again then sort of took off. So for myself, the historical, you can go many different ways, but as you go historical and historical adjacent, for myself, I don't want to play a very strict historical game because if I go back into those times, it just gets too dark. One of the earliest role-playing games was like Swashbuckler. And that's the Three Musketeers. Okay. You want to be swinging from the chandeliers. You want to be, sliding down the staircase and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you break the physics of the world. You're breaking a lot of the rules too. You're sweeping, one versus many. It's historical, yes, but at the same time, it's you want to. It's an RPG. You want the fun and adventure out of it. So I'm not as hard over on it has to be, the historical adjacent is fine by me as long as it builds the adventure.
Is it? So to try and slap some labels on things, Rocky, it sounds like you're fine with sort of the cinematic aspects of things that sort of, you know, those great movie moments of that maybe show folks doing things that are outside the bounds of what normal folks could pull off, but not necessarily outside the bounds of physics and science as we know it.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. James
Yeah.
Bond 007 was a wonderful role-playing game system.
Yeah.
But none of us are James Bond, but just the system itself created so many beautiful cinematic moments, and the way the system worked to help you do chases, bidding for chase and things like that. It created the adventure. I'm not looking for a simulation. I'm not looking for, a Sim City. I don't want to be going around in the dark ages of, or even like the Renaissance or something. Like I go back to the Three Musketeers. I don't want to be in that dark, horrible, filthy living conditions. I want the adventure, and so I take the history, but then I want it with my adventure over the grittiness out of it, so to speak.
Yeah,
and it's a history versus Hollywood question, and I totally agree with you, and I would never. I think a lot of my historical role playing games certainly were allied with that, where we played Swashbuckler, or Flashing Blades was the one that we played, where there was always remarkable situations. I suppose when I think about some of the like when we introduce things like Cthulhu versus the Nazis or zombie Nazis or things like that, anything that's too fantasy or science fiction oriented, where there is no simple realistic possibility, like I say, real world possibility where that could happen. Was there a Force 10 from Navarone? I don't know, but that was a great scenario to play in a World War II. That would be a great World War II role playing game to play. So, absolutely, and of course, we always have to make allowances for the people that we play with. So for example, one of the things I know, the Allied Army of World War II was not integrated, which might be problematic if you have a racially diverse group of gamers that you're playing with. There weren't women that were serving on frontline combat. But what's interesting about the historical role-playing games is I think that there's always, with a little bit of research, there's always an opportunity to include those things. Sergeant Rock always seemed to end up fighting with a girl from the French Resistance. And Jackie Johnson, who was the boxer who fought with Sergeant Rock, he never would have been in that unit, but by gum, he was there. So.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost like a better label on historical role playing would be sort of realistic role playing, but back to Rocky's point of, you don't necessarily want full realism of the how dark and non-advanced some of these things can be. You don't want to have to necessarily worry about open sewers and city streets spreading disease everywhere. You want the cool cinematic stuff without necessarily all of the grit and grime of things. When we're looking at settings, kind of overall.
Why? Are they broken?
One of the things you were asking about, Byron, and I think Rocky was kind of getting to this a little bit in terms of that heroic cinematic feel of things, but why would you want to play the historical RPG? Is it just to explore what that time might have been like? That may not be the right answer if we're sort of dramatizing some things for cinematic value. Is it to get a better understanding of motivations and principles and why people might have behaved the way they did in certain times? Well, you got to play pretty important people for that to really matter. Like, why would we want to play historical RPGs?
And so one of the things that I found most compelling about historical RPGs when we played them, and it didn't occur necessarily in the moment, it occurred later on upon reflection. I played a lot of fantasy and sci-fi games, and there was always a, good and evil always exists in very clear-cut definitions when you play a science or fantasy role-playing game. And the thing that I found most compelling about historical games or historical role-playing games is, first off, there was that ability to be in the moment. Like, what was it like to be on the Oregon Trail? What would it have been like to be on the retreat from Moscow? So on the practical, just simply what I will call the gameplay perspective, the game designer Will Wright, who designed The Sims, talks about the possibility spaces. Gaming a historical RPG or historical RPGs allow you to really have another conversation about what would have happened if Pickett hadn't charged across the wheat field. You can game that with regular board games and also in the historical RPGs. The other thing, though, that I found very compelling was that the evil that we do, or the evil that we encounter in a historical RPG is the evil that, say to use gendered language, the evil that men do. It is the real, it is a reflection of what really goes on. And those situations can provide for interesting dilemmas or interesting choices. No one walks into an orc village in a fantasy sci-fi game and has to make a decision about what's going to happen next. Or if you're on a dungeon crawl and you kick open the door, you kind of know what you're going to do based on what you're seeing behind that. But what if you kick open the door and there's a German soldier with his wife and his kids there? Or what do you do when you're fighting in a civilian built-up area? So like I say, that Sauron is pure, consummate evil. There's no denying that. There's no denying that he creates an army out of the ground and whose sole destruction whose sole goal is the destruction of mankind. And, Hitler, horrible guy that he was, Pol Pot, and a few others, and Stalin. Yeah, they're really bad guys, but they had people that are just like you and me who believed them and who supported them. How do you reconcile that? And I think historical RPGs give you an opportunity to look into that world. Are you just going to kill all the orcs / Germans? Is that what you're going to do when you walk into a village? Or are you going to get confronted with different moral dilemmas and moral questions? And that was the thing that I really found most compelling. I never took prisoners when I played fantasy role-playing games. No one left the battlefields. But what about in historical RPG? I mean, with a few exceptions. I mean, there's the French Foreign Legion at Cameroon, and Custer and Creasy Grass. But there are a few exceptions. But you are ultimately going to be put into a situation where maybe you've got to make different choices, and I find that very compelling. So, Rocky?
I think for myself, one of so my original role-playing experience began with Traveller. And one thing about Traveller characters is Traveller characters are very much everyday, quote unquote, as science fiction, but everyday people. You're a mustered out military service. Yes, there was some rules in there for psionics and stuff, but frankly, we never used them. A blaster pistol, a Colt 45. It's how many dice damage does it do? The point is that there was a very non-heroic style of gaming. So I never got into the big fantasy. I never got into you're leveling up with fireball cast and all this other sort of crazy stuff. I always played a very normal, very normal people, very normal approach. So a historical RPG, it wasn't that we were trying not to be heroes, but how do you be a hero when all you have is just that you're just a human, you're just a person? How can you be a hero? How can you deal with those situations? What can you do? And that's really what the way we always played it, and the way what's always made the historical pieces is, hey, dropping you into that setting with those conditions and those tools and those the cultural drivers around you. What can you do? There's some historical RPGs that I really enjoy. I like some of the westerns. I do a lot of the military RPGs for the war games. Because of the war games aspect and the connection to wargaming and stuff. There's some historical RPGs I cannot tolerate one bit. And a lot of times it has to do with nothing to do with the it has to do with how the designer maybe framed the setting. There's one in particular that I looked at it first. It was like, oh, this is cool. Luft 46, secret weapons after the war, all this awesome stuff. I picked it up. I was going to play it and everything, but then I sat down and I read the author's notes or the designer's notes, and I never picked it up again because it just their view of how they wanted the world to be or how they were portraying that was just so at odds with where I stood. That I just I love the idea, but I'm never gonna step into that again because I'm a normal person, and I would, as a normal person, I would not want to be in that world that they've created. So I just simply walked away from it. Although it was neat, cool aircraft and everything, but nope, ain't gonna do it because it's just not where I want to be a normal person at.
The 12th season of Mentioned in Dispatches is made possible by all of our Patreon supporters who pledged at the top level. The Armchair Dragoons would like to thank Michael Sonneborg, Fred and his dog, Chet Bell, Hellcat6, Patrick Garrity, Stagger Wing, Kevin Bertram, Mike Quigley, Martok, and Joseph Knorr for their support of the Regiment of Strategy Gaming, which helps us bring you the best strategy gaming articles, events, and this podcast. You can join us as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
I think you raised a really interesting question, and that was, when you think about sort of the traditional sci-fi fantasy role games, there was always sort of a purpose or a grander purpose. And I don't mean complete a mission, but that when I played fantasy war games, the idea was you'd level up and eventually you'd be able to buy a manor, or you'd run a guild, or if you were in Traveler, you'd eventually buy your own spaceship and stuff. But there's sometimes a historical, and that does exist in some of them. I mean, we used to play Skull and Crossbones, where the goal of that was to eventually get enough gold and booty and jewels to buy your own pirate ship, your own crew. But for some of them, like the Westerns, which we played a lot of, which I played a lot of Boot Hill, sometimes the overall goal is just to survive another day, right? It's just to survive. Like, there is no necessarily boss battle. And there is no grand reward. Like, you're not looting bodies along the way, or probably not looting bodies on there. You're not accumulating wealth and magic potions. The goal is just to survive, to play another game somewhere else. And I think that was the thing that you mentioned, like what it's like just to be a normal person in maybe some extraordinary circumstances. I love how you phrase that. That was one of the compelling things for me.
Yeah. Sort of jumping ahead in your own notes there, but how when you're looking at why you're wanting to jump in there and the experience that you want to have, I would almost think that the easy way for a lot of the audience to visualize certain things is to tie them to some certain movies or maybe some books that are pretty well known by a bunch of the audience. Rock, you mentioned Three Musketeers. Byron, some of your show notes mentioned some World War II stuff, Saving Private Ryan, Bridge Too Far, Force 10 from Navarone, you mentioned earlier in the call. But I mean, there's the TV shows that you were talking about, Rock. You mentioned Combat. I was thinking Rat Patrol, but again, very similar thing. The Sergeant Rock comics, or some of those old military comics that you had from in the mid to late 60s, when you had actual World War II veterans still working on some of those things. But even into the 80s, I remember when Marvel had the Nam comic going for a long time by Vietnam veterans that had written some about their actual experiences there, and movies like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket coming around. And then if you were stuck watching with your spouse, then you put on Purple Hearts instead. But ones that were grounded in a reality that didn't have a lot of fantasy or sci-fi elements. The physics belong to our world. The people belong to our world. The experiences belong to our world. And sort of, hey, that was a cool story, Bridge Too Far, the combat TV shows, whatever. I wonder what my adventures in that space would look like. Almost seems to be kind of the underlying inspiration for some of these things. Despite the fact that it got off, it wasn't intended to be fully historical, and there were clearly historical inspired characters. Mel Gibson's The Patriot, if you're doing American Revolution. Yes, there were some varying composites of people floating around in that movie, but there were obviously real world parallels to some of those characters were. Mel Gibson's character was clearly supposed to be Francis Marion, right? That was the Swamp Fox of South Carolina. That's who he was supposed to be. And the folks in South Carolina will tell you, yes, that's exactly who he was supposed to be, because he's a state hero down there. Those sorts of, I wonder what it'd be like to be a part of that, I think is an underlying motivation for a lot of folks as to why they're playing these things. Rocky, am I close?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, just look at some of the TV shows can go melodramatic, but some of them just have a good solid adventure. I look at like the Sharps series for Napoleonics.
Yeah,
that is a great RPG setting. You are a military unit, yes. You're part of the army, yes, but you're always getting assigned the special missions. You always end up here. You are in an army of tens of thousands, but it's always the same 5 of you that are going off and doing something, doing the special mission, going behind enemy lines, even just the special courier piece, whatever it is, the same 5 of you behind enemy lines was built very much on that same piece. You're an infantry squad, but you are always getting assigned the special missions, the reconnaissance by yourself, the delivery, taking the courier messages someplace. The more recent war stories from was it Firelock games?
Yeah, Firelock.
Yeah. I mean, again, same thing. You're a squad, an infantry squad, but you're getting assigned, and they have rules in there for where you fit in the battle. But really, it's what is your squad doing? And the goal is not to be sitting in the front line and trying to fight the war in the trenches right there. No, you've got a special mission. You're going behind enemy lines. The Jeep's going to be your best friend, not the Sherman tank.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff. So those pieces of how historical RPGs go, again, we sort of come back to the history versus the adventure. To me, the historical games can be great pathways to adventure. And I think as we move on and we get older and stuff, sometimes we start seeing, one of my favorite books right now is The Black Count, which is sort of the true story of the Count de Monte Cristo. So, I mean, if you like, that's an awesome book. It's an awesome story. It's a great RPG setting. But if you go read The Black Count and then you look at it, it makes you reframe how you look at that whole story. And there's a whole nother world of adventure that opens up in those historical RPGs like that, all based on the history. Because sometimes the reality is stranger than the fiction, which is what RPGs let you get at.
That's an excellent point. I mean, the old story, the old saw, right? History stranger, truth is stranger than fiction. There are so many crazy examples throughout history where people are in unique situations or find themselves like cut off or behind enemy lines or tasked with interesting things, and it leads into a sort of fantastic adventures. I also think that in my opinion, and this has to do with gameplay and how much your game master sort of wants to play into this. I think a lot of those situations, no matter what they are, and again, this might just be an artifact of my fantasy science fiction role-playing game. We always had a problem that we wanted to solve in those fantasy role-playing games, whether it was Ravenloft or whatever. History, though, and real life usually doesn't provide us with too many problems. It usually provides us with a lot of dilemmas. So problems have solutions. Dilemmas, though, often leave us in a situation where we have to figure out what is the lesser of two evils. What is, you mentioned, we talked earlier about Vietnam era popular media, like Platoon and the comic book Nam, and there was another one called Vietnam Journal. So if you're playing that as an RPG, what do you do with the stereotype incompetent lieutenant? What do you do with the hard charging sergeant that decides to kill an innocent civilian? How does the group respond to that? So the history of those situations, as grim as it is, as difficult it is, can actually provide some really interesting adventures and sort of some very interesting challenges for a group of individuals. And it's part of the reason why I was so drawn to this genre, because we had a lot of problems we had to solve with fantasy role-playing games, but usually it was a fireball or magic missile spell. It was all solved in the end with the shedding of a lot of blood. But that isn't the case.
Yeah, I like the I don't think we weren't playing Air War because nobody ever actually played Air War. People just suffered through it. But we were playing some sort of dogfighting something or other. I don't remember what it was. And one of the guys went to shoot a Sidewinder. And he's like, I cast regular missile and went to shoot. A kick out of that one. I think there's that let's deal with some real world problems. Let's deal with some real world discussion in some of these things. And I think Rocky, going back to what you were saying about the sharp things being an example of, yes, you're in the military, but you're constantly getting assigned these different independent sort of actions somewhere or behind enemy lines, rat patrol. Why is every RPG about a special forces team sort of thing? Well, because you want the players to have some agency there, right? If you're an infantry squad, barreling onto the beach at Normandy, there's only so many of your own decisions you're going to make that aren't being dictated by the platoon coming from the company, coming from the battalion, coming from the brigade, coming from the division headquarters. At a certain point, you're told very specifically what to do, and that is what you were expected to do. And if you don't, lots of bad things can happen to lots of other people. When it's behind enemy lines or, whatever special mission they're on, you are acting independently. The decisions you make, you do have to make yourself because there's nobody else telling you what to do, that you may not even know where you are. And that's sort of the point. So I think given the settings in a military specific sort of context, not just general history, I think you have to be those independent operators. Otherwise, the game, it doesn't completely fall apart. It's all probably a lot less fun,
Yeah, exactly. And that goes all the way back to even the earliest days of the historical role-playing games. Is behind enemy lines was you don't want to be a regular unit. You want to be that independent. You want to have that freedom. That's part of what made T2K so nice, because the setting built in the breakdown of authority, the setting built in the breaking of the chain of command. You were on your own because the way the setting put it there, but that was what you wanted to be anyway. Yeah. You were trying to survive, trying to move along. You were a military unit, yes, but you had all the other parts of it had fallen away. Which, again, for whatever setting you do, historical, I think a lot of that's where, again, the balance between adventure and history comes in, and we make a lot of as much as we're playing a historical RPG, we make a lot of exceptions of history in the RPGs because we want to get to, at least in the groups I play in, we want to get to the adventure of it. So some of the history's there. The history provides the framework, but it's by no means the straitjacket that keeps us in play. Which brings me up to some of the other points that Byron had here that made me think, because some of the questions he had was like, what is the challenges? What the biggest one he put was encumbrance. What do you carry? No bag of holding. I mean, I know from my the way we play it is a lot of these pieces is like you have what you carry with you on any given moment of the adventure is probably pretty light, but somebody's always got that giant duffel bag, and there's the 2.5 ton truck with all the other stuff that you got. The classic traveler ship's locker. We don't have that. Well, check the ship's locker. What's there? I mean, some of the good games will have the go beg your supply sergeant, or better yet, you have a character who is that scrounger who you say, okay, we're going to take a moment here, and you're going to go off and go scrounge. And what's my difficulty to go to acquire this absolute, I'm going to find this in the middle of Germany in the middle of World War II. No way. But but I rolled high enough. I got it. So again, the adventure over the history.
Yeah, but and that can certainly be part of the adventure. I mean, we used Boot Hill on one occasion to do a sort of a semi part of Wagon Train / the Oregon Trail, where you do have limited resources and you've got a mission to go. And it was sort of there wasn't a bottomless bag of holding, but that was part of the adventure was, hey, like, again, it fell into the whole dilemma aspect. Group of French Napoleonic soldiers leaving Russia. what do? Do you hoof it, or do you pause at the village and make some questionable moral choices about how you're going to find food? And how do you feel about that? And how does the party reconcile that? Like if you bust into a peasant's hovel and there's a woman with 5 kids, how much bread do you take? How much bread do you take from them? Like, because there is that side. Again, if you did fantasy and those were orcs, the question would be, there wouldn't even be a question as to what you would get. But and I think sometimes the reason why I bring those things up is because they do add, or when used properly and appropriately, they do add to the choices. I mean, like, again, it builds into the dilemma about how do you solve this problem. Magic users can just whip up a spell and solve a lot of things, or clerics can heal. But how do you deal with how do you take on 7 men when all you got is a six gun?
Yeah. Try and get one of them to shoot the other for you. So,
but that's
that brings up an important question in terms of some of the practical aspects of things that get hand waved over for sure in most fantasy games, but might also in some cinematic games. How many times have we watched somebody take way more punches than they ever should be able to? Like every Bruce Lee movie ever. But the in a bar fight, even some of the hand-to-hand fights you see in some James Bond movies, you're like, holy cow, what the heck? Why is this guy still getting up? But the idea of sort of how does healing and disability and death and sort of medical care at large actually work in a historical based role-playing game? You don't just have the cure light wounds spell to bail you out of everything, and at a certain point medic's got to put a bandage on something. But depending on how far back you go, I mean, there wasn't Neosporin everywhere, right? They're dressing wounds in the Civil War by pouring some bourbon on you. You go back to Roman times, you might get a little bit of olive oil rubbed on you, but what else are they really doing for you? They may dab some honey on there, which, yeah, it's great. It's a natural antiseptic, but it ain't Neosporin. So they're not repairing limbs; they're just amputating them so the rot doesn't set in. And it seems like medical care is a fairly important piece of historical role-playing games. And how realistic versus cinematic do you want these to be? How much research do you want to have to do to figure out, what's appropriate for the setting you're trying to play? Like, Byron, how much digging do you do to get ready for these things?
Well, the way that I think the way that I would sort of lead into this is say that, and I sort of ponder the question about, like, well, how part of it is game mechanics, right? Part of it is, what is the game system you're using, and what does it say that you can do? Like, are you dead are you dead, or are you just dead when you hit 0 hit points? And it's sort of what
mostly dead, or is he all the way down?
Yeah. So, but it runs into some. So, first thing is knowing. I mean, we played a lot of Boot Hill. Well, firearm combat in Boot Hill is usually pretty. Any firearm combat, any RPG is usually pretty severe. So how do you deal with that? Do you, as a game mechanic, or whether it's a game mechanic or whether it's something that you're doing in the background, are you nerfing the rolls as the DM? Are you, like, if you roll a natural 20 behind your GM screen, are you like, oh, he just nicked you instead of, so are you nerfing? Or are there, I mean, and this is the question, like, have you run into any interesting tools, interesting game mechanics, like, the old mulligans or rabbit's foots, or I think some games use concepts of luck, where you have so many luck tries where, like, so if a guy rolls and I can't remember what game it was that it was one of the editions of Boot Hill. I think it was maybe edition 3rd, where if someone rolled a critical hit or something like that, like it was a mortal wound, and Boot Hill had mortal wounds, like on the die results table. If you used up one of your luck points, you could brush it off, but you had to tell the story like, oh, it hit the Bible in my chest pocket or whatever. Oh, it was a squib load. There wasn't enough gunpowder in it or something like that. So, and that was a deliberate game mechanic put in there that, quite frankly, we ended up when we played these, and we played about 4 major historical games. We ended up using them just because it was one of those situations where, you know, like I say, when you're in combat, you've got to eventually come to a point where, like, 50 guys shot at me and they all just barely missed me, where you have to have some other gaming. So.
Those sort of hero point kind of mechanics, that was something fairly common in the old James Bond RPG. So.
Yeah, he had hero points in there. You had a luck statistic in there. So how lucky was a character to begin with. You had hero points. But a lot of those metagame pieces, I think to Byron's point, it goes to the mechanics of the game. It also goes to the group. Our groups, when we played, again, sort of coming from the Traveler era, Traveler either helped us or cursed us through a lot of our RPG life. With Traveler, since you had a character that could die during character creation, we ended up not, and just as a group, as we were growing up, and even to this day, I'm just not that attached to a character. I enjoy investing some time in a backstory and stuff, but at the end of the day, if the character dies because that's the way the dice fall, I tend not to, go high and right over it. As a matter of fact, it was interesting in War Stories there, you have your characters, but you always have then your NPCs, your other squad mates. And it explicitly calls out in the rules that, hey, these people are there, they're part of the squad, they're these other members of the team, maybe the 3 of you, then this is the other 2 or 3 of your squad. But they're specifically there for that. If one of your characters dies, you can pick up this already half-baked, half-created character, and with a couple of easy die rolls, you flush it out, and boom, you got your next character. And it only took you guys maybe 5-10 minutes in between a scene, and you're back in the game. There's no more session 0, no session 0 reset. Everything doesn't come to a screeching halt. The GM doesn't have to nerf, doesn't have to make those calls, because the game system supports. Hey, it happens. Move on and keep playing.
There was an interesting historical RPG about Napoleonic Age of Sail, and one of my favorite ones was Privateers and Gentlemen. But the one that I haven't played that deals with that is In Harm's Way. I think it's by Mousetrap Games. And what they have you do when you create your characters, you create a boat. You create 3 characters. You create an officer. You create a ranked crewman, and you create, just a lanceman, like some guy who doesn't know what they're doing. And you sort of play the game with those 3 characters, so that if something happens to, hopefully nothing happens to all 3 of them, although that could certainly happen at the Battle of Trafalgar, or if they happen to be manning guns on L'Orient at the Battle of the Nile. So that was one of the mechanisms of dealing with that. Another game that had an interesting way of sort of dealing with this was, it was interesting, I'm not going to say it was successful, was FGU's Bushido. In that game, which was samurai combat in feudal Japan, when you died in that game, you had the opportunity to use some of the karma points to create a new character, so that the new character you create, as long as he was in the same class and same, like he was a samurai or whatever, a Ronin or whatever it was, you could sort of use some of the experiences or some of the karma from that earlier character to create your new one. The problem with Bushido, and it is one of the things that I sort of run into every now and then, these historical rules, is it was so deeply into the history, like they were trying to make it so very, let's play a role-playing game set in feudal Japan, that it just became really confusing. Like we never really figured out the death mechanism, so we just kind of used the D&D, like, you're going to lose one hit point for the next 20 turns until you're dead, unless someone heals you. So it is interesting to see how, or that gameplay, that the game designers just, have always just said. Brent, did you ever get a chance to read through the historical war game set in the American Revolution for 5e?
Nations and Cannons.
Thank you, Nations and Cannons. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got the base book on PDF, although I have a hard time reading some things on PDF just because I'm staring at screens all day for work. I'm staring at screens all day dealing with Dragoon stuff. When I want to read your book, I want an actual physical book in front of me. So I've read a good chunk of it, but I'm probably going to pick up a hard copy sometime soon just to be able to read an actual book at some point. And we've had Pat on the podcast and at one of the ACDCs talking about some of the backstory and the purpose and the reasoning behind it. I will also say, folks that are interested in actually playing Nations and Cannons, the guys from the Players Aid, Grant and Alexander, run a Nations and Cannons campaign or series of games at Buckeye Game Fest each year. They've done Nations and Cannons there. Last year's involved a runaway wagon. A runaway wagon that was on fire, and the wagon was full of horse manure. So that became a very laugh-inducing cinematic moment for that campaign that is still discussed now a year later. That still comes up. It's interesting in that it does a good job of setting you in the feel of the time where it takes place. The historical notes are fantastic. Given that it is intended for educational markets, that very much makes sense. What it doesn't do as well, and Pat will even tell you it's kind of by design. It's not intended to put you in the shoes of the major continental decision makers of the day, right? You're not expected to be one of the folks signing the Declaration of Independence. You're expected to be somebody in a town, on coastal Massachusetts that has to deal with the fallout of what happened with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You're one of those families, in South Carolina, just trying to make ends meet, stuck between the colonial military and the Tories, and now the British have shown up to start hunting Francis Marion around, and they want to know if you're helping and why not, and why, and we're going to burn your lands because we think you are, whether we have proof or not. That, and how do you deal with the day-to-day life in that kind of environment? And I think that's more, Pat's even said, that's sort of more of their intent of the kind of atmosphere they're trying to set for those things. Folks that are interested can, they can grab the link on this episode and go listen to the interview with Pat and go watch the video with him and Merle from the ACDC talking about designing for the American Revolution. But yeah, that's definitely there. I do want to throw something back at you though, Byron, is that we've got stuff from the American Civil War. We've got stuff from the American Revolution. We've got stuff from American forces stuck overseas in Twilight. Where the hell are the Canadians in historical gaming? Like, where are they? Why don't you guys show up?
Yeah, well, we mostly just sat on the periphery of American Western expansion and said, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're the guys that actually let a Sitting Bull kind of hang out for a while instead of hunting them down. and come on, and let's face it, how good would a War of 1812 role-playing game sell in America where Canadians get to burn down part of the White House? I mean, it's stuck in a gut.
Well, you'd be amazed.
Well, maybe today, yes.
Probably more popular than you think. Yeah. But that said, I mean, there is a certain amount of built-in myopia around the gaming market, and we're as guilty as anybody from, the conventions we talk about tend to be U.S. conventions. The games we talk about tend to be U.S. games. Many of the guests we have tend to be U.S.-based guests. Part of that is time zones, right? I mean, it's just, we had Pius on last season talking about games in the classroom, and the dude got up at 3:30 in the morning to join us on the podcast, which was nuts. Like, I thank you, Pius. We appreciate you waking up early in Lithuania. I would have been happy to adjust the time that we were recording to make things easier for you. But, I hear what you're saying about how many folks in the U.S. would be willing to buy a War of 1812 game where you get to play the Canadians. I would almost throw that. Who cares? right? I mean, there's plenty of not Americans to sell these games to. Yes, we're a big market. We're not the only market. Are there some Brits out there that would be interested in doing that? Probably.
Come on now, where's your RCMP Mountie, RPG?
Yeah,
we could do it the Monty Python way, or we can do it
or
better,
failing
way.
that, is there an RCMP like historical sort of setting book that uses the Savage World system, or uses the Fate system or something else? Like it doesn't have to be its own custom made system. Nations and Cannons builds off the D&D 5th edition mechanics. Grab some 5th edition mechanics and go do for a while, when Polyhedron was double packaged with Dungeon Magazine for a while there, you sort of flip them over and there was, start from the back of the magazine. You had the other one. They were building different games off of the 3rd edition engine, and one of the ones that they had was a World War II military RPG using the 3rd edition mechanics. And I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. We referenced it on another podcast. I went and looked it up, and now I've completely brain dumped it again. But it's sort of, you can be waiting in on the beach in Normandy. You can be a part of the airdrop at Market Garden. You can be stuck on a beach in Italy. There's all kinds of different scenarios that they built into it. But basically, you're a grunt in World War II using the D&D 3rd edition mechanics. So you could probably grab the 3rd edition D&D mechanics or the 5th edition mechanics and be some sort of explorer crossing the Canadian wilderness, be one of the First Nations peoples resisting the explorers. You could be, those French Canadians sort of stuck between the Brits and, the French have kind of abandoned them. Oh crap, we have to leave Montreal. Where are we headed to next? I guess we're headed to Louisiana. And, there's all sorts of great adventure tales within the Canadian, pantheon there that you could be doing. Why not?
Yeah, and it's a great point, because it's one of the things that I think makes the historical RPGs so compelling, is that there are some really fascinating stories to tell about. I mean, in Canada, the RCMP, when they first set out from Ontario out west, they were the Northwest Mounted Police. And they went out at around a period of time where the American West was, it was, I think, 1875, I think the long ride, the wild ride started. So that's right in the height of some of the, the Lincoln County Range Wars. One of the things that was going on was moving booze across the borders and stuff like that. So there is, and it wouldn't be that hard to use a system like Flashing Blades to do something in New France, into what is modern day Quebec. I think ultimately, though, I mean, when it comes to this, I think ultimately, and it was sort of one of the questions I posed, despite the fact that history can be more fiction, or fact can be more interesting than fiction, sometimes we tend to gravitate towards those great stories. Like, we played pirates because pirates, how can you not? When we played Flashing Blades, it was indeed the Three Musketeers, because that's such a compelling. There's dozens of stories that you could tell from that time. Spanish, the English, there's all, you could import that story into the New World. And I think Flashing Blades may have even had a scenario set in the world. You could have done something interesting there. So, but it is one of those, and French Foreign Legion, that was another sort of a favorite milieu as well. I think, to be honest about the country that I'm very proud of to be from, Canadian history is, and there's the Fenian raids, there's a rail rebellion, there's all kinds of stuff. There's the reason why British Columbia, where I live, is called British Columbia, is because a bunch of Americans came walking up the Columbia River and thought that they would claim it for their own. So
54-40 or fight, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So.
Yeah. As we go back further in time to maybe some potentially non-military sorts of RPG stuff, but you know, pre-gunpowder era, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of great role-playing game options set in pre-gunpowder historical eras that are strictly historical, right? There's all sorts of ancient Egyptian or Bronze Age or, you know, heroic Greek role-playing that all inevitably involve minotaurs and the favor of the gods and, you know, some strange incantation that does X, Y, and Z. And, you know, there are a variety of different kinds of those RPGs that have a strong underlying historical flavor, but inevitably Horus flies down from the heavens and does something wackadoodle. You know, can you guys think of any, or do y'all know, have any experience with any straight up, strictly historical / realistic RPGs pre-gunpowder that really stick to the history of things that ever gained a whole lot of traction?
I can't think of any, but I think a lot of it goes back to, because the further we go back in history, the less we want to deal with those questions of, you know, do we want to play Justinian's Flea or do we want to play Jason on the Argonauts?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want Black Plague. Nope, no, thank you. But you know, Medusa, can I get past Medusa? Okay, yeah, I'll play that one. I mean, I know those aren't exactly the same eras. I know, but you're all that the further you go back, the more adventure I think you want out of it, and the less you really want to deal with the history of it. Just because
I have a bit of a theory of it myself. I was just curious what you guys thought.
Well, I mean, you know, one of the early RPGs was Chainmail, which was set in, you know, which was basically medieval guys beating the crap out of each other with swords. You know, the role-playing aspect to that, I don't think there were ever missions or anything built on that. But again, it really comes down to the creativity and the interest of the game masters, which is sort of why I find this series so exciting. That you could use any hack and slash role-playing game rules to do, you know, what's the German forest where the Romans lost all their legions, you know,
forest.
Yeah, you know, like 5 guys who survived the slaughter and need to make it back to Rome. That's an RPG adventure that might be a one-shot, but it still would be a great story. There are some really great opportunities to tell those stories, or something in the middle. I mean, you know, if you read Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood is, you know, leaving. I mean, if you take it to its root, it's leaving the Middle East, returning back to England, where an evil despot has taken control of the Shire or whatever it was. Yeah. So there is an opportunity to write those stories. Are there dedicated role-playing games for them? I think that when I look at the catalog of old FGU titles, and FGU, I always say there was a saying, FGU never met a historical era it did not like. They wrote, and then invented a few. They had one of them. I think that I think they had like a knight's story.
Yeah. Well, and GURPS source books too were quite.
Sure.
I mean, there was a GURPS Robin Hood.
Why? Are they broken?
I think one of the reasons for that is that if we're looking at the historical research needed to sort of reasonably populate that world and paint that picture as the game master or as the scenario author, there's a ton of primary sources post gunpowder, in part because we got printing presses at that point, and we've got a language that is far more recognizable to our own. That it's not just the fact that it might be in English, but the form of English is very similar to what we have now. At a certain point, you get back to pre-Norman England, and yet technically the Domesday Book is in English, but if you read the original text, you're reading a foreign language. You know, a lot of the records from Anglo-Saxon England, you're reading a foreign language, and I can confidently say that because I have several textbooks teaching you how to read those things on my shelf downstairs. I have a copy of Bright's Anglo-Saxon Reader. from the late 1800s, and yeah, it's a foreign language, I promise. But even more so, even cleaning up translation issues, primary sources from pre-gunpowder era adventure settings, Roman, Greek, Persian, whatever, though the primary sources from back then have those fantastical elements built in.
Yeah.
Never mind, the Roman and Greek mythologies. Just you go back and read the Persian Wars from Herodotus, and there are fantastical elements built into that, built into the Aeneid, built into the Odyssey. And those are the only sources we've got. And so if you're going to craft something that seems real from the only points of view we have of the people of that time, that the only sources we have those fantastical elements baked into them.
Yeah. It is. Sometimes it definitely is the case sometimes of, one of the criticisms of history is like, great things done by great men, right? I mean, the opening words of Caesar's conquest of Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Well, there's an entire, says who? That's an entire role-playing game there, whether you want to play it from the Roman perspective or whether you want to play it from the Gaul perspective. The perspective of the Gauls, but you've got to go out and do your math. You got to do a little bit of research. And the great thing about those sort of and one of the things that about those older older era of hack and slashes, the technology doesn't change that much. I mean, a good set of hack and slash rules works for a Roman gladius just as well as it does for a Zweihander. You can still use those same kind of mechanisms. Whereas you move forward in time, and we do see technology makes a big play, right? I mean, I think one of the things I mentioned in my notes. Hey, 1837, crossing the American plains, you were carrying a flintlock pistol. 2 years later, if you were lucky, you had a Colt Patterson with 5 shots in it. So it is easy to tell stories in the past. You just need to have that creative impetus to look to see behind the lines. Like, hey, what do you mean? Gaul is divided into 3 parts. That's a story right there. But that's a gaming adventure right there. But you don't even have to dip into the waters of Asterix and Obelix comics to do that.
Rocky, you had talked about the cinematic storytelling, early on in this podcast. One of the, in terms of an ancient or pre-gunpowder story that is, that is not one with built-in fantasy elements, there's actually 2 that come to mind that I think would both make for great particular adventures. One of them's been adapted to the screen several times, but you go back to Sir Walter Scott's original Ivanhoe. Is great individual storytelling there, but strictly from a movie perspective, if you guys have seen it from about 15-ish years ago now, the Channing Tatum movie The Eagle, in Roman Britain, where he's on this quest to reclaim the standard of his father's lost legion. That there's no supernatural elements in that one at all. It's just a fairly cool historical romp, and there's probably a little bit of ahistorical stuff just to make things look good on screen, but the underlying story of these couple of guys on an adventure to go reclaim something, that would make a pretty solid RPG quest there if somebody could rebuild that as an adventure module somehow. Those are 2 that I can think of off the top of my head, but neither of those are coming from primary sources either. By the time Sir Walter Scott's writing Ivanhoe, it's 600 years later. So those are ones I can think of.
It seems like there's a market here for someone to go into the module writing business for historical scenarios for 5e.
Sure. Let me know when you get it up and running. I'm happy to help proofread, but no, I'm not doing the writing. Well, and knowing where Rocky is in his day job, he doesn't have the time to do the writing either. So not these days. Byron, you mentioned some of the actual real world inventions that I don't remember who it was that said it, if it was Sagan or Asimov or some other sci-fi connected philosopher, but the idea of any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And all I can think of is, Red Bull is the modern day potion of haste. But but something like, Neosporin is a modern day sort of cure light wounds ointment, and to have something like that available back in the Dark Ages or earlier, there was some medical technology we knew about a little bit, but not near to the point we do today. Obviously, to have penicillin available, to have, whether it's certain kinds of painkillers or certain sorts of surgery techniques or whatever. I'm not a medical expert, so I'm struggling for terminology here a little bit. That's the one that immediately comes to mind, but obviously there's other kinds of technology that might be relevant or useful and may appear to be semi-magical to the folks who don't know any better. I'm sure gunpowder seemed that way to the folks that had never seen it before. So, Rocky, thoughts, ideas along those lines?
I think it's all those things can be done in a historical RPG, but it really comes down to just can you find a mechanism to sort of describe it, and how much are you willing to suspend your disbelief of history? I mean, when it comes down to the Boot Hill or those era games, I always fall back on the Indian shaman, the Indian doctor out there who has that herbal, gets those herbs together, goes out and grabs a couple of flowers and some plants and everything, and mashes up something in the little dish and then pastes it over your wound, and things get better. Is that strictly historical? Maybe not. Maybe yes. But does it feel historical enough, and does it let you advance your story? Yeah, you can keep going. You can find a reasonable way to work your way through it. I think part of it comes down to also is just how realistic a game do you want? I mean, hey, are you going to be that? Hey, you get that scratch. You stepped on that wrong thing, and you got that scratch in your foot, and and then the gangrene is setting in. Is that going to set you up to get your peg leg for your pirate? I mean, all that stuff happened. It was there. I mean, Sawbones was there for a reason. Is that what you're going to do? How far are you going to take it in your game? Is it how historical you want to be? Does it? I mean, we were always one. If it advances the story, I'll take a peg leg. It's cool.
Yeah, and I think you can always. I mean, you can translate some of those. I don't know. I guess I will call inconveniences into any gameplay setting. I mean, when we played Traveler, one of the big challenges that we had sometimes when we were doing Enter the Abandoned Spaceship was things like, how much oxygen do you have? And who's going to spend time fighting the alien slime, and so that the engineer can try and bring the oxygen system back on, while the co-pilot engineer is trying to take the spaceship or the space station out of a degrading orbit. So these are all like minor things, but the way that you mount those together can contributes to that whole concept, and you can do that in any story you want. There's no reason why, if you're playing a Star Wars science fiction game, you can't have how much water are you consuming on Tatooine be an issue for your characters to think about. Right. And it's another challenge, another opportunity to introduce a dilemma into that gameplay environment. I suppose when I used to play, sci-fi role-playing games, there were too many gimmies. Like, you could just use a magic spell. You're out of water, you could just conjure water, you could do something like that. And I think that was part of the reason why I started to gravitate towards, historical rurrole-playing games. Like, what do you do when your powder's wet? If you're playing, if you've got a flintlock rifle and you fall into the creek, what are you going to do? So, and those are all, I think can add to the gaming experience.
And I think a lot of that is, I mean, you just maybe think about the whole Battle of Vincennes. Battle of Vincennes took place after a huge rainstorm, and one of the major issues they had is all their powder got wet. So how did they get powder? How did they go to all the locals and find the ones who, I mean, they had to scrounge amongst the locals out there and find places to get new gunpowder and to dry their powder and all those sorts of pieces. It's one way it's sort of fantastical, but on the other hand, it's also can be very historical, and I think that's part of what sometimes makes historical RPGs interesting for me is when I go back and I find some of these, sort of like really wild and incredible stories, and I sit there and I sort of go like, man, that would be a great RPG, because in the moment, would we have been able to figure that out? Would we have been able to do that? I mean, they did that for real. Could we even come halfway close playing a historical RPG to some of the awesome stuff that people did in real life?
Yeah. The life of Kit Carson. If you've seen the movie The Revenant, Hugh Glass's journey back to civilization after he was attacked by a bear and abandoned by his. That's largely based on. Of course, it doesn't end up being the good versus evil fight at the end, but the Hugh Glass's story of survival is again, now that's those are single stories, but you could certainly turn those into group adventures. Hey, the group of Mormons that where was the past that ended unfortunately for everyone in the Mormon settlers going across the Rocky Mountains there. So, there's another, terrible situations for a small group of people. How do you do it? How do you get through the Oregon Trail? It was a great computer game, even in the old text-based version.
And they all died of dysentery. All right, we are well past our 1 hour mark, so I will say we do need to kind of wrap this up. But Byron, since this one's all your fault, we're gonna let you have the last word on. Is there any closing thought you want to have on historical RPGs here?
Well, I just wanted to ask Rocky what his and you as well, Brent. What were your favorite RPGs? And do you list off 3 of your favorite historical RPGs?
Historical.
So, I mean, I'll go back to the Swashbuckler.
Yeah.
Swashbuckler back in the days. I loved, we played Swashbuckler because
the Yakinto, was that the Yakinto?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You could do Yakinto one. The Behind Enemy Lines.
Yeah.
And for other historical ones, I mean, I got to come up into then T2K.
Yeah, T2K.
That was, I mean, for T2K was like a documentary for me because I was coming of age right there at that same time.
Yeah.
So, and that one still carries on. I mean, I'll say today the modern day successor is probably going to be War Stories.
Yeah.
War Stories very much the modern day successor for Behind Enemy Lines. I like Rider with the Cepheus engine.
Yeah. I just bought that a little while ago. It looks really interesting.
It's Cepheus engine, but it's the Wild West, which is not that different than Firefly, Serenity. When it all comes right down to it, I mean, space westerns and real westerns. I mean, they're similar for a reason.
Exactly.
But those are the historical ones that I go to these days. How about you, Brant?
Well, T2K for many of the same reasons, right? That was lived experience for a certain generation of us. So that one absolutely. Look, if we're gonna lump the James Bond one in there, then definitely that. It was a fun game to play that had a lot of great ideas in it. But it was also this pantheon of movies that were very formative for me for a lot of my life. And I can almost sort of not fully tell the story of my life, but I could almost tell the story of my life by where I was living as each successive James Bond flick was released. The first one that I cared about in the theaters, that I remember in theaters was For Your Eyes Only, but then rolling forward from there, I can tell you where I was and what was going on in my life as each of those got released over the years. And I can do that without necessarily knowing what the specific year was. I would be tying that to where I was in my life at those times. So James Bond for sure. The other one, I'm going way off the beaten path here. Back when the old Better Games freestyle roleplay system was pretty popular, they had a colonial America historical one that was called Crimson Cutlass. Not a great game, but a fun exploration of the setting. Look, Nations and Cannons is a better game, but Crimson Cutlass was a good exploration of that very early colonial conquistador initial exploration with a side dose of pirating and buccaneering going on. So late 1500s into the early 1700s. That was a fun game to kind of play and goof around with. It requires a fairly skilled GM because there are definitely some holes in the rules you have to work around. Hard as hell to find anymore these days, but still pretty good. It uses the same underlying system as the Barony role-playing game, same company, so it's the same underlying system there, if you can find it. But definitely very cinematic and a lot of fun to play. Of ones that you could actually find on the shelves somewhere, yeah, I would definitely put Nations and Cannons up there. I think it does a really good job of adapting those 5th edition mechanics to that colonial era of the American Revolution, and doesn't take much to really sort of expand the coverage as far back as the French and Indian War and as far forward as the War of 1812. So it does a good job of covering all that.
Okay, add-on question. James Bond or Top Secret? And you can't say James Bond because it gives you the opportunity to say, do you expect me to talk money? Goldfinger. It's got to be, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. It's got to be something more than Top Secret or James Bond. Which one?
Bond.
Bond.
No question. The mechanics. To me, still these days, I mean, if you go into the original rule book and you look at their example of play, it's 2 columns. One side is the scene from Goldfinger. Yep. And the other one is the adventure on the table. And it is so well written and so well done. And the mechanics just come through, integrate so cleanly into the story. I mean, right from there, I was sold. That this isn't just a game that takes place in the James Bond movies. This is a game that makes the James Bond movies.
Yeah.
So that's Top Secret was nope, sorry.
Top Secret was the thing you played because James Bond didn't exist, and once James Bond existed, you were fine. At that point, you had the rest.
Yeah, we had a terrible experience with Top Secret because up until that point, we had played up. So one of my favorite historical RPGs. The first one was Boot Hill. That was the first RPG I ever played. It was the first game of that ilk. We discovered that before D&D and Melee and the rest of them. Another one we played quite a bit of was Skull and Crossbones. I don't know why, just someone ended up acquiring it and really enjoyed playing that. And then I had a friend who was really into karate and kung fu and that kind of stuff. So we bought Bushido. But Bushido was really a dog's breakfast. It was so hard to figure out how to play that one. So I'd actually say the D&D, AD&D Oriental Adventures was where we went, and we played that as as a historical scenario. So because he was really into feudal Japan, so we did a lot of Ronin and samurai and that kind of stuff. So it was, and we knew the rules. We knew the rules as well because it was basically D&D. I really liked Privateers and Gentlemen by also by FGU. The problem with that is I discovered that at about the same time that my gaming group discovered something called Girls. And so I never really, we had like a half game of playing that where we built some characters and we started figuring out how to fight. And then, I don't know, I think someone's girlfriend came over and all the 20-sided dice quickly went under the table and we sat around talking. So those would be my 3 favorites. But, I mentioned Top Secret. We played a little bit of D&D, then we landed into Top Secret World. And Top Secret was a disaster for us because we just couldn't move. Like, what is a Thompson machine gun but a wand of automatic missile fire? And what is a hand grenade but a fireball spell for the everyman? Yeah. So it ended up just being a modern weapons combat game that was like we never figured out how to play it as a top secret game.
Yeah. It was clearly trying to fill a niche, but trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Yeah. Instead of rebuilding from the ground up, and that showed. So, guys, it's been fun. We are well over the hour that I've been trying to keep this season's episodes just for my own sanity for editing, but that's fine. It's been a good, fun conversation, and I hope the audience has gotten something out of this, and some, if nothing else, some food for thought. Right? We're not pretending to be laying down the law and have the absolute last and final word on what we're doing for historical RPG. RPGs, but I hope we've got some food for thought and maybe some ideas for people to go explore, whether it's inspirations for some campaigns or scenarios, or just some different kinds of rules to go dig around and look up, or to think about how to approach some of their own issues and some of these things that you can't just hand wave over as magic happens and suddenly, your problems are solved. So I hope folks have some fun digging around in there. Audience, we've got just a couple episodes left, mainly focused on some conventions, and then we're going to wrap up this season with kind of a look at the state of the hobby wargaming world with some new guests. We're bringing a new voice or two into the shows, just to give you some different perspectives, some people that kind of know a little bit more about the wargaming world that we haven't had on the show before. So I hope you look forward to that. We'll see folks. Buckeye Game Fest might actually be going on by the time we release this. So we hope we'll see a couple of you at Buckeye Game Fest, but if not, we've got Origins this summer and the Fall Assembly in October, and we hope maybe some folks will be able to make it to either of those, or whatever your nearest convention is, and go have some. Byron, you're still doing Bados Con, right? You're still heavily involved with that one.
We are indeed. Gaming season in Canada and the West Coast is mostly winter. We start in it's either spring or winter. Summertime, we're outside.
You're outside, yeah, because you actually can be without having to excavate 12 feet of snow.
Exactly.
Yeah. Without having to ride an elk to wherever you're going.
We don't. Just for people's. I live in the West Coast. We got 3 days of snow this year. There's a palm tree literally living right out my window. So in the West Coast, West Vancouver actually is a we have palm trees growing here. So I have
that's
11
3 more days of snow than I've
had
had in the past 4 years. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so cool. Rocky, thank you for being here, especially as we're recording on an off night. We appreciate it. And Byron, thank you for being here and for coming up with an interesting topic on this and helping steer the ship a little bit.
My pleasure. It's an honor.
And audience, thank you guys for being here and indulging us on this romp through some historical RPGs. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mentioned in Dispatches.